Hello and welcome to Composition and Design Part 2. So this particular lecture will be referencing the required reading, Seeing Like a Camera. So you might want to look at that while you're also listening to me talk about the contents that I feel are important from this required reading. So here we're looking at a picture by Hiroshi Sugimoto, a photographer that I think I've mentioned before. You can check out his work. This is a long exposure of, those are airplane trails in the background. So these are all airplanes flying around. And what he did is he would oftentimes set up these series of photographs. This one from Union City, it's a drive-in theater. And so he would project a film. I don't know what the film was because it wasn't always in the title of his work. And that would be his exposure. That's why the screen is all blown out white. So let's say it's a 2-hour movie or something. So this is a great example of, we've been talking about compositional styles, and now this is a little bit more focused on seeing like the camera. And the reason why I think this image relates to that is because you can't see all those airplanes with your eyes, right? You can't see something with a long exposure. You can see the results of that from the photograph, right? So how the camera sees something specifically. And I think it's a pretty good example of, again, that interesting relationship when it comes to the balance in the photograph. So is it asymmetrical or symmetrical? And this is one of those photos that kind of falls almost in between. Like there's aspects to it that are very symmetrical, but it's just a little asymmetrical. But if I were looking at it and talking about it and describing it, I would just reference as it's a symmetrical photograph since things are pretty lined up. I would imagine that was his intention. All right, so let's keep going here. So, like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit and referencing motion and stop motion, minimum depth of field, but basically all the things that, when you make decisions about the camera settings and location and the framing, the subjects, all of that affect the meaning of the photograph. And there are certain things you can do with a camera that make it more specific to this concept of it's a photograph, right? This is the work by Vivian Mayer. She's a really interesting photographer. There's a couple of links here. And this is a great example of a faster shutter speed, right? Because we're stopping the motion of these birds and minimum depth of field. This is another example of her work, and this talks a lot about her really interesting life story. There's a documentary that you can watch about her work. Another example of a slower shutter speed. Those people are moving. And so again, what the camera is offering is affecting sort of the story or the narrative that the viewer could potentially create with the work. Something that's really, I think, cool and significant about photography is that the pictures translate the world you see, right? And that's again going back to this idea that the camera enables the artist or the photographer to do things that the eye might not be able to do, to stop motion, to freeze time, like all these really cool things. And so the pictures that you make, again, are your visual representations of how you see the world. So I just think that's a really cool concept and something that hopefully by the end of this class, you can take more ownership over some of these technical things, regardless if you're using your digital camera or your camera phone. This is a photograph by Sebastian Salgado. He did a lot of work in Kuwait around the petroleum industry. So this is more of his work from a series called Workers. This is another one of his photographs that I really like that kind of, again, references you consider and decide how you frame and expose your photograph. So this is a great one from Bombay from a series called Migrations. It's obviously a gelatin silver print, which is a black and white. It's like a traditional black and white print. And it's a longer shutter speed, but a smaller f-stop because everything is in focus from the foreground to the background. But the people that are getting off this train to go to work or go shopping or whatever it is that they're doing in their daily life in Bombay, they're moving, right? And so by having a slower shutter speed, you're showing that motion, which in this picture really translates as a visual metaphor for the river of people, or that's how I interpret it. And then I think it's also really cool that it's in black and white, and most of the people, or a lot of the people, are wearing a light colored shirt. So those are cool things that, again, our camera allows us to do specifically. So one of the things that we also get to do as taking ownership to our photographs is thinking about meaning and content, design, and how we use these technical skills that we're learning about, minimum depth of field, showing motion, to further the subject matter in our photograph. But you also have to realize that, you know, there's this technical part that potentially has meaning. This is a photograph by Diane Arbus from 1962. But that there's a process, like, you know, you don't just take one photograph. You get to decide from the multiple photographs that you've taken which one best communicates your idea, with both the combination of exposure, lighting, and then also, what do I want my photograph to say? So this happens to be a series that she did where you can see she's taking a lot of pictures of some kid in Central Park. She did a lot of work in New York, and they're all pretty mundane. You know, he's just being a kid. But she chose to blow up and print and exhibit and put into books this picture of the little kid with a toy grenade in his hand and this silly expression with the, you know, his little short suspender thing off his shoulder. And that's what she chose to use. And that's, again, going back to thinking about the design and the content. Diane Arbus is a really interesting American photographer who was, in the 50s and 60s, one of the first photographers to really photograph the people on the margins of society. So street people, dwarfs, giants, transgendered people, nudists, carnival performers, all sorts of folks that, you know, today are part of, it's just that we live in this diverse world. They're no longer, in my mind, considered on the margin of society. But in the 50s and 60s, they really were. And so her images are important to think about because she was really looking at these people not like from a distance, but really creating like a connection. And her work is really important in that way of thinking about how we connect with who we're taking pictures of or what we're taking pictures of. And so kind of thinking about, you know, when I say to you, I encourage you guys to take more than one photo of whatever it is that your subject is or whatever you're photographing, right? Here's an example of Martin Parr's contact sheet. That's what this is called, a contact sheet. And we're familiar with his work. You've seen his work. We've talked about him. And so here's, you know, he's in some sort of a restaurant or eating facility, and he's taking a bunch of pictures, and then boom, he gets this one that is the one that, again, of course, he chooses to publish. And there's a lot going on in this photo that really grabs you, and a lot of it is the expression of the person who's working at this counter. So those are things and why it's so important to think about being ready for something called the decisive moment, right? How do we capture the decisive moment? Well, we have to be ready for it. So our exposure is ready and we're in the environment and we're taking a lot of photos. And then here's some examples of decisive moments where, you know, this is just adorable with the little girl yawning and everyone in their costumes. And this is a woman who just happened to kind of stop right in front of some graffiti that's on a wall, and just being ready and aware. And part of that is sometimes observing also the quality of light and asking yourself questions of, what do I expose for? The highlights, which would be this bright area here, or the shadows, which is this dark area. And this photographer, Ray Metzler, made this photograph exposing for the highlights. So then the shadows go really dark, right? And you're learning about how to control your whatever your device is to get these kinds of specific results. And so you might want to ask yourself when you're thinking about the quality of light, what do I expose for? Highlight, shadows. Do I want the light to be soft or hard? And what is the direction of the light? So this is a great example of hard light. It's very directional. It's probably just navigating through a couple of buildings to hit this one area in this downtown. And so thinking about, there's kind of like 4 qualities of light that you can apply to your photographic process. Contrast, the difference in illumination between the lit and the ambient sides of your object or your subject. So that's basically the difference between the areas of the photo that are light and the areas of the photo that are in shadows, right? So this image has high contrast because the shadows are really dark, but the highlight is very light. So that's a high contrast photograph. The direction of the light, where is it coming from? That's a really helpful key in either responding to the available light, so natural light, or creating your own light by doing a little setup. Where do I want the direction of the light to come from? The intensity, how bright is the light, or how dim is the light? That can also really impact your photos. The examples that I'm showing you here, the light was pretty intense to create this high contrast. So the intensity is really important as well. And then is the light hard or soft? And I think that, we'll talk more about the qualities of light, but this begins to give you some language and to pay attention. Is the light soft? So is it diffuse? Is it an overcast day where you're not going to have high contrast and hard shadows? Or is the light direct where you're getting hard shadows? Like these examples that I'm showing you here with these photographs by Ray Metzler from 1964. So really interesting also, so not only considering the light, this is a great example of truncation, which we talked about with one of the 10 keys of composition. And it's that the person's head is truncated, but then it shows up here in the shadow. So again, like these are really fun things that are specific to seeing like a camera and then you as a photographer pushing the shutter and making the photograph. But a good example of really hard light. And then soft light, which, also has really important aspects depending upon what kind of photographs you want to make. This is a photographer, Yo-Ming Lee, who does these beautiful portraits of trees, and I love how people write about his work. Beautiful and intellectual meditation on trees, nature, environment, and perception. And that's so fascinating when we think about this idea of seeing like a camera and how we control things. So he's famous for taking and setting up these backdrops. These are not photoshopped. And then taking these very deliberate portraits of trees. And his work, here's it's very simple in concept, but it's very complicated in its execution. He has to have all of these people and these, I don't know what they're called, the things that go up and down, but he's got to have this equipment. I mean, this is an expensive adventure that he's getting into to make these very specific pictures that are looking at his ideas and symbolism around nature. So his work, I'm sure, he probably plans things out and really pays attention to the weather map and things like that to make sure that he can make these pictures with very specific time of day and quality of light. Really good example of asymmetry, right? So if I folded this paper in half, it would be very different on each side. So we've already talked a little bit about the time of day, but that's something that I want you to take into consideration with the photographs that you make for this learning unit about composition. So even though we finished talking about high key, low key, composition. I'm sorry, we're talking about composition. The previous learning units, I have introduced you to a lot of concepts, one of them being time of day. Bring that information into the images that you make for this learning unit. And just here's an example of paying attention to the time of day. It's a great example of rule of thirds, shape and form. A good example of high contrast, hard light, and again, exposing for the highlights. So the shadows are going very black, and we're getting all this color from thinking about the time of day. So try to think about how to use light within your compositions, and how the time of day and the quality of light, regardless if you're using natural light time of day or working indoors, how you might want to control the quality of light and how that can impact your composition. So back to the reading, what's in the picture? One of the most important considerations with your photographs is, when you think about what do I want to include in the frame and what do I want to not include, or what do I want to exclude from the frame is a better way of stating that. So what do I want to include and what do I want to exclude? And so you can do that by either getting closer to your subject matter or further away. So here's a good example of, what do I want the photograph to be about? Is it about a pumpkin patch in a specific time of year? Or is it about a really cool old truck? And so that relationship to what I include or what I don't include has a big impact on how the viewer then appreciates or considers the photograph. If this photograph being made was for a pumpkin patch to sell their pumpkins, obviously this top photo is going to get more people to come buy their pumpkins. This is going to get more people to come buy their truck. I don't know, but just so, and thinking about these ideas when you're making your photographs, that's why we make more than one, right? We spend time looking at something. What do I want to put to the left or the right of the frame, right? How do I want to, maybe walking around your subject. So here's another example of kind of a modern day contact sheet, which is something you can make in Lightroom or another post-production program where you can actually look at everything close together, mark it up. Some photographers print these out and write on them. So you can kind of see the process that the photographer went through. They quickly looked at all the photos and just kind of circled the ones that they liked. And then they went back and didn't look at all of them anymore. They kind of focused on the ones that, were really speaking to them. And then they landed on this as their best photograph. And that's a personal choice, but it also is a great use of rule of thirds. And I love how you can see the lock arm and minimum depth of field. So there's a lot of things that are happening in this photograph, again, that go back to the artist, the person making the photos, but also what the camera can achieve. And thinking about what's around the edge of the frame, you can either, you can create some tension by thinking about what's on the edge of the frame. You can also make people feel uncomfortable. Some people might look at this photo by Larry Fink and go, "What? Why did he crop it like that? Why is her hand so forced?" His work was all about trying to use the frame differently. And so here's a great example of frame within a frame, right? And he was really taking this idea of seeing like a camera when he was making these pictures in the 60s. And even today, here's a contemporary, these are some newer, well, this is not a newer piece, but this is a newer photograph that he's been making in LA. And so again, thinking about how we want to use the frame of the camera in unexpected ways. And so these are both great examples of like, oh, well, what are we looking at here? Well, if you learned a little bit about his work, this particular project is looking at older women and like, as we age, older men and women, our hands do all sorts of interesting things, something that he wanted to photograph. Definitely always think about what's behind your subject. I know it's really hard. I also have struggled with this as well because you're so focused on your subject. But here's an example of like when there's a tree behind your subject, how now there's like a pole coming out of their head, where maybe if they move a little in 2 seconds, the background can be, just a plain out of focus fence, right? And so thinking about like, how do I want to do that? How do I want to use the background to maybe tell a story, right? There's nothing wrong with either of these photos of this little boy. This one is like, oh, we're working in the yard today. And this one feels a little bit more like an intentional portrait. So again, by paying attention to all of these components of your composition, you just get to decide. This is a lovely picture of a flower, but I really like how this one is placed because I don't know if I need to see that little teeny dead flower. And I just like the way the flower is kind of presenting itself now, and the minimum depth of field in the background, just subtle, sometimes body shifts, moving a few inches or a few feet. You can really make a big impact on your photograph and the background in relationship to the subject matter. And then there's photographers who really use the background as part of their symbolism. So I'm not sure how to say this guy's name. Wuldert Deerhurden? Sorry, that's really bad. But really interesting work where, he's using the background with like all these ads for Liz Claiborne and really sexy clothing stuff with a series of some sort of religious folks in the foreground. And they could be, actors on break from a play. I don't know. It's in New York. But as a photographer, we get to kind of choose, how do I want to line up what's in my photograph? I think this is hilarious. Like, I've got this awesome Calvin Klein ad, and then there's a 24-hour park thing, kind of in a special spot. So you guys, as a photographer, you get to decide how you want to line things up within the overall composition of your photographs. And something else that we've already kind of talked about is what's in focus. How much of the picture is in focus? Katherine Wegner, this project that she's been working on for a long time around the Moscone Center, this was in the 70s, she did a lot of stuff with maximum depth of field. So everything from, the foreground to buildings in the background were very sharp. So she's using a small f-stop, maybe like f16, or a small opening, a bigger number. I have to be very careful. So like f16 or f22 to create these really luscious images of the construction of the Moscone Center. And this is a spark interview of her if you'd like to learn more about her. She's a Bay Area photographer. Or maybe you want to focus on minimum depth of field, which we've also discussed. And Sally Mann is someone who uses that quite a bit. So thinking about like how to have less focus as part of your compositional style. And I also like how this one, again, like that relationship to the subject in the background, right? This road, the curve of it, the subjects, the family kind of placed to the left side of the frame. All of the elements for this image are just really thoughtful and stand out. So thinking about your f-stop is really important when you're combining some of these technical things with your composition. And the four major factors of depth of field are f-stop, the size of the image sensor, the focal length of the lens, and the distance between the subjects and the scene. And so here's a great example of, you could do something like this with your phone, where if you put something really close to the lens, it's automatically going to go out of focus. So I think this might have been shot in, this photo was made while Ernst Haas was inside of his car. So this is like the dashboard looking through the window so that what's outside is kind of in focus, but you can create depth of field as well by placing things really close to the lens of your camera. So that's where the distance between the objects of the scene can impact this concept of minimum depth of field or selective focus. This is a really interesting photographer, Hank Willis Thomas. This is a video still, so if you Google him and you want to learn more about his work, he's more of a conceptual artist, so he uses photography and other media besides photography to think about these conversations around identity, race, history, class. I'm really liking his work. He's a new artist that I'm learning about. And so really great use of minimum depth of field, even though it's a video. You still apply all of these concepts, regardless if it's a photograph or a video or a film. So this is a quote that he wrote that I really liked. In recent years, I have approached my art practice assuming the role of a visual cultural archaeologist. I'm interested in the ways that popular imagery informs how people perceive themselves and others around the world. So maybe you want to learn more about him and look at his work. But really good use of minimum depth of field, or something that we can also refer to as selective focus. And so this also just shows you what I was talking about before. The focal length of the lens or the millimeter of the lens will have a big impact on this depth of field. And as you can see here, a wider 16 millimeter lens is going to give you a really different depth of field than a 200 millimeter. And you can see that the person is about the same size, but just how the longer lenses, which would be 200 millimeter, compress what we're looking at. So some photographers will only photograph using a longer lens because they want that specific aesthetic. So those are things, again, that go back to seeing like a camera and using the tools of photography for these very specific visual gestures. Shutter speed's another one. We've got stopping motion with a fast shutter speed and showing motion with a slower shutter speed. And how that impacts, again, the composition and how you use these technical skills that you're learning within your creative process. So showing the motion. This is Michael Kenna, a longer exposure. More work by Michael Kenna, a longer exposure. Again, a night photograph with, I think, like the moon, or I'm not quite sure what's moving in the background. Or stopping motion. This is the work by Jamel Shabazz, a photographer who did a lot of work in New York in the 80s. I really like the composition with the two stop signs, again, creating a little bit of balance in the background of the subject matter of the stop motion. And another one by the same artist, Jamal Shabazz, stopping motion with a fast shutter speed. This is another, a fast shutter speed, great example of rule of thirds, and also an example of panning. So panning is something, now that you're getting more familiar with the shutter speeds and controlling your camera device, panning is a really cool skill to have, where the background gets all blurry like that. That's because the subject is moving and the photographer is moving with the subject. So you can Google panning and learn a little bit more about it if you choose. Another example of panning and rule of thirds. So again, during the exposure, so the shutter speed for this might have been like, I don't know, maybe like a 30th of a second, depending upon how fast your subject is moving, would depend upon what shutter speed you would need to use to get the panning results. But you have to move when you're taking the picture. So you need to have a little bit of a slower shutter speed. A lot of people do this with a tripod, but it's a really cool effect. And then here's kind of, yet again, just another example of how, we've got rule of thirds. We're thinking about the relationship of the subject matter in the background. This is a fishing, a farm that, produces fish. So he's feeding the fish, maybe a shutter speed of like a 30th or a 60th, maximum depth of field. But because of a slightly slower shutter speed, we're actually seeing the motion of the grains. And you can even see all the fish coming to eat whatever it is that he's feeding them. So that kind of gives you a sense of more information about how your camera gives you specific results. And then this is a little bit about the general critique format. So I think what I'm going to do is, introduce this here. I will have like a separate short lecture where we can just focus on these concepts to help you with your critiques for your thinking about your own work and how to talk about your classmates' work. But you can reference this in the PDF. There's a lot of great questions and things to reference and think about when you're either talking about your classmates' work or thinking about what you want to photograph and how you want to photograph for a particular homework assignment, or even, just work that you want to make outside of this class. All right, well, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email on Canvas.